Hey, fortune finders. If lottery twists and family truths hook you, subscribe and spin the wheel of wisdom with us. Mom, figure it out. Not my problem. You're sick, my own daughter said before hanging up on me. I stared at my phone, holding $333 million in lottery winnings, and smiled. Emily had just failed the most important test of her life, and she didn't even know it. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. You're probably wondering how a 67-year-old grandmother from Ohio ended up with a fortune this size, testing her own children like some kind of twisted fairy tale. Well, let me take you back to where this all started. 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday morning that changed everything. I'm Linda Harris, and I've been buying the same lottery numbers for 15 years, my late husband's birthday, our anniversary, and the day my grandson Noah was born. Call it sentiment, call it stupidity, but those numbers meant something to me. Tom, my neighbor, always joked that I was throwing away good coffee money. Linda, the odds of winning are worse than getting struck by lightning while being eaten by a shark, he'd say every week as I walked to Miller's corner store. That Tuesday started like any other. I was having my morning coffee, watching the news when they announced the Mega Millions numbers. I wasn't really paying attention until I heard the first number, 14, then 23, then 31. My hands started shaking as I grabbed my ticket from where it was magneted to the refrigerator. All 6 numbers matched perfectly. $333 million after taxes. Still over $200 million. More money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. My first instinct was to call Brian, my son, then Emily, my daughter, then little Noah. Well, not so little anymore. At 20, I wanted to share this miracle with the people I loved most, but something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of last Christmas when Emily made that comment about finally getting some decent inheritance when the old lady kicks the bucket. Maybe it was Brian's constant hints about me downsizing because the house is too big for just one person. Or maybe it was pure intuition, but I decided to wait. For 3 weeks, I kept the secret. I met with lawyers, financial advisors, set up trusts. I planned carefully. And then I decided to conduct a little experiment. If my children truly loved me, they'd help me when I needed it most, right? Even if they thought I had nothing to give in return. The test was simple. I would call each of my children, tell them I needed help with money for my heart medication, and see what happened. The medication story wasn't entirely false. I do take heart pills, and they are expensive. But with my new fortune, money was no longer an issue. Love, however, was about to become one. But that phone call with Emily wasn't even the worst part of my test. Brian's response was somehow even more crushing than his sister's. When I called him with the same story about needing help with medication costs, he didn't even let me finish explaining. "Mom, I can't keep enabling this behavior," he said, using that condescending tone he'd perfected since becoming a bank manager. "You need to learn to live within your means." Enabling this behavior? I almost laughed. The woman who'd raised him and his sister alone after their father died, who'd worked double shifts at the diner to pay for their college educations, was being lectured about money management by a man whose student loans I'd quietly paid off 5 years ago. "Brian, I'm not asking for much. Just enough to cover my medication until my Social Security check arrives." I kept my voice steady, though inside I was already grieving for the son I thought I knew. "Look, Mom, this is exactly what Emily and I were talking about. You're getting older, and maybe it's time to consider some changes. Have you looked into those senior communities we mentioned? They handle all your medications, meals, everything." Emily and I were talking about, so my children had been discussing my future behind my back. How thoughtful of them. "Let me think about it," I said, though I'd already heard enough. But Brian wasn't finished delivering his lesson. "And Mom, I'm going to have to block your number for a while. Emily thinks we're being too soft, and maybe she's right. Sometimes tough love is what people need to face reality." The line went dead. My own son had just blocked me rather than help with a prescription. I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd bandaged Brian's scraped knees and helped him with homework, where I'd celebrated Emily's good grades and comforted her through her divorce. The lottery ticket was still on my refrigerator, worth more than this entire neighborhood. And my own children wanted to ship me off to a nursing home rather than help with medication. But Noah, my grandson Noah, had always been different. He was Emily's son, but somehow he'd inherited none of her selfishness. He was the one who called just to check on me, who remembered my birthday without Facebook reminders, who still hugged me tight when he visited. Surely he would pass this test. I dialed his number with trembling fingers. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear road noise in the background. "Grandma Linda, what's up?" His voice was warm, genuinely happy to hear from me. "Noah, honey, I hate to bother you, but I'm in a bit of a pickle." I explained the same story about needing help with medication costs. There was a pause, and my heart started to sink. Then he said the words that changed everything. "How much do you need? I've got about $500 in savings, and I can drive down this weekend. Are you okay? Do you need me to take you to the doctor?" $500. It was probably every penny he had saved from his part-time job at the campus bookstore. He was offering me his entire emergency fund without hesitation, and he wanted to drive 400 miles just to check on me. "Oh, sweetie, I couldn't take your money," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Grandma, you've never asked me for anything ever. If you need help, I'm coming. No arguments." After I hung up, I knew what I had to do. Noah had passed the test with flying colors, but his mother and uncle, they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about family loyalty. That weekend, I bought Noah a new car. You should have seen the look on Emily's face when she pulled into my driveway Sunday afternoon and saw the brand new silver Honda Civic parked next to my old Toyota. Noah was washing it in the driveway, grinning from ear to ear. "Whose car is that?" Emily asked, getting out of her Mercedes that I knew for a fact she was behind on payments. "Mine," Noah called out, dropping the sponge to come give me a hug. "Mom, Grandma bought it for me. Can you believe it?" I watched Emily's face cycle through confusion, suspicion, and finally anger. Her perfectly styled blonde hair didn't move in the wind. "Hairspray will do that. Mom, can we talk?" Emily's voice was tight. "Inside now." Brian pulled up just as we were heading in, and I could see him taking in the scene. His face went through the same emotional journey as his sister's. We gathered in my living room, the same room where Brian and Emily had played with their toys 30 years ago. Emily perched on the edge of my sofa like she was afraid it might contaminate her designer dress. "Where did you get the money for a car?" Brian demanded, having let himself in without knocking. "Last week you were calling us, begging for help with prescriptions." Was I begging? I tilted my head, genuinely curious about his word choice. I thought I was asking my children for assistance. Silly me. "Don't play games, Mom," Emily snapped. "How much did that car cost? $20,000, $25,000. Where did that money come from?" I settled into my favorite armchair, the one their father had bought me for our 20th anniversary. "Well, I decided not to buy my heart medication this month. Apparently, cars for loving grandsons are more important than keeping this old ticker beating." Emily gasped. "Mom, that's crazy. You can't stop taking your medication." "Oh, now you're concerned about my health. How thoughtful." I kept my voice sweet, but I could see Brian catching on to my sarcasm. "This is insane," Brian muttered, running his hands through his thinning hair. "Noah, get in here." My grandson appeared in the doorway, still beaming. At 20, he had his mother's dark eyes, but thankfully not her selfish heart. "Noah, you can't accept this car," Brian said firmly. "Your grandmother clearly isn't thinking straight. She stopped taking her medication to buy you a car. That's not love. That's mental illness." "Uncle Brian, what are you talking about?" Noah looked genuinely confused. "Grandma's fine. We had a great talk yesterday about college, my job, everything. She's sharper than all of us." "Son, your grandmother called us last week begging for money," Emily chimed in. "Now suddenly she has $25,000 for a car. Something doesn't add up." Noah's expression shifted, and I could see him putting the pieces together. This boy was smart. Scholarship to Ohio State, studying business. He looked at his mother, then at his uncle, and I saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "You called them asking for help?" he asked me quietly. I did. I told them I needed assistance with my medication costs. And what did they say? Brian and Emily suddenly found the carpet very interesting. The silence stretched until Noah filled it. They said no, didn't they? My own mother and uncle refused to help you with medicine you need to stay alive. Now, Noah, it's not that simple, Brian started. But Noah held up his hand. But when I offered to help, you bought me a car instead. Noah's voice was soft with wonder. This whole thing was a test, wasn't it, Grandma? Smart boy. But his mother and uncle were about to get much smarter, too. A test? Emily's voice rose to that pitch dogs probably found painful. Are you seriously telling me this was all some elaborate scheme? I looked at this woman I'd given birth to with her perfectly styled hair and her designer handbag that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Scheme is such an ugly word, Emily. I prefer to think of it as a character assessment. Brian started packing, which he'd done since he was a little boy whenever he was upset. This is manipulation, Mom, pure and simple manipulation. Is it manipulation when someone shows you their true colors? I asked, keeping my voice calm. I made a simple request for help. Noah immediately offered everything he had and wanted to drive 400 miles to check on me. You, Brian, lectured me about enabling behavior and blocked my number. Emily told me it wasn't her problem. Those were your choices, not mine. We had valid concerns, Brian protested. You've been struggling financially, making poor decisions. Have I? I stood up and walked to my desk, pulling out a folder I'd prepared for this moment. Let's talk about poor financial decisions. Brian, remember when you bought that motorcycle 2 years ago? The one you couldn't afford? Who quietly paid off your credit card debt so you could get financing? Brian's face went pale. Emily turned to stare at her brother. And Emily, that spa retreat you took after your divorce when you were getting back on your feet. Who do you think covered your rent for 3 months while you found yourself? How did you? Emily started, then stopped. I know about all of it. Every emergency loan you never paid back. Every favor you forgot to acknowledge. Every time you took my help for granted while planning what you'd inherit when I'm gone. I sat back down, amazed at how calm I felt. Did you really think I was going to spend my remaining years being treated like a convenient ATM by my own children? Noah was staring at his mother and uncle like he'd never seen them before. You guys have been taking money from Grandma while complaining about your finances to me, while telling me you couldn't help with my textbooks because money was tight. That's different, Emily said weakly. How is it different? We're adults with responsibilities. You're a college student. Noah shook his head in disgust. No, Mom. I'm a college student with a part-time job and a grandmother who taught me the value of working for what you want, unlike some people. Emily was crying now, but I suspected they were tears of frustration, not remorse. Mom, I apologize if we seemed ungrateful, but you have to understand our position. I'm a single mother. Brian has his own expenses. You have champagne taste on a beer budget, I said simply. And you've both been supplementing your income with my generosity for years while treating me like a burden. So what now? Brian asked, his voice bitter. You're cutting us off, choosing Noah over your own children. I'm choosing kindness over entitlement. Noah has never asked me for anything. Yet when I needed help, he offered everything. You've both asked for plenty, but offered nothing in return. The room fell silent except for Emily's sniffling. Finally, Noah spoke up. Grandma, can I ask you something? His voice was careful, like he was handling something fragile. Of course, sweetheart. Just how rich are you? And that's when I decided it was time for the second phase of my plan. I smiled at my grandson, this young man who'd proven himself worthy of trust when his own mother and uncle had failed so spectacularly. Noah, what would you say if I told you that your dear old grandmother won the lottery 3 weeks ago? He blinked. I'd say that explains the car. Brian snorted. Mom, be serious. How much could you have won? A few thousand, maybe $10,000. Try again. Emily stopped crying, suddenly very interested in our conversation. What do you mean, try again? I walked back to my refrigerator and returned with the lottery ticket. The one that had been hanging there for 3 weeks like a perfectly ordinary piece of paper. I handed it to Noah. "Read the numbers, sweetheart." Noah looked at the ticket, then at me, then back at the ticket. His face went completely white. "Grandma, this is the winning numbers for the Mega Millions jackpot from 3 weeks ago." I finished gently. $333 million. Brian lunged for the ticket, but Noah pulled it back. "Uncle Brian, don't." "Let me see that," Emily demanded, but I held up my hand. "The ticket is just a souvenir now. The money has already been claimed, invested, and placed in trusts." I settled back into my chair, enjoying the look of pure shock on their faces. "Turns out, when you're worth over $200 million after taxes, a $25,000 car is basically pocket change." The silence that followed was magnificent. Brian's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. Emily had gone from pale to red to pale again. $200 million, Brian finally whispered. "Give or take a few million in investment, returns this week." I couldn't help the satisfaction in my voice. Amazing how the market responds when you have that kind of capital to work with. Emily found her voice first. "Mom, we had no idea when you called asking for help, if we'd known." "If you'd known I was rich, you would have helped me." I shook my head. "Emily, do you hear yourself? You would have helped your mother if you knew there was something in it for you." "That's not what I meant." She backtracked quickly. "Isn't it?" I turned to Brian. "Son, let me ask you something. If I were still living on my small Social Security check and needed help with medication, would you help me?" Brian's pause told me everything I needed to know. "I see." I stood up, suddenly feeling very tired. "Well, I think this conversation has been illuminating for everyone." "Mom, wait," Emily said desperately. "We need to talk about this. We need to figure out how to move forward as a family." I raised an eyebrow. "Emily, 20 minutes ago you hung up on me when I needed help. Brian blocked my number. Now you want to talk about family." Noah was still staring at the lottery ticket like it might disappear. "Grandma, I can't accept this car. Not if this is too much." And that right there was why this young man was about to become my only heir. But Brian and Emily were about to find out just how expensive their greed had become. "Noah, sweetie, you offered me everything you had when you thought I needed help," I said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "That car isn't charity. It's a thank you gift from someone who can finally afford to say thank you properly." Brian had moved beyond shock into what I could only describe as desperation. "Mom, I know we handled this wrong, but we're family. We can work through this." "Can we?" I looked at him steadily. "Brian, in the 3 weeks since I won this money, how many times have you called just to check on me? How many times has Emily?" They exchanged glances. "We've been busy," Emily said weakly. "But Noah called me twice this week, just to chat. To tell me about his classes, ask about my garden, see if I needed anything." I turned to my grandson. "And when I said I needed help, what did you do?" "I offered to drive down immediately," Noah said quietly. "With your last $500, I added. "Meanwhile, your mother and uncle, who I've financially helped for years, told me to figure it out myself and suggested putting me in assisted living." Brian ran his hands through his hair again. "Okay, yes, we made mistakes, but you have to understand the position we were in. Money's been tight for both of us. Emily's dealing with single motherhood. I have my own bills." "Brian," my voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Stop, just stop." I walked to my desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. "Do you want to know what I did during these 3 weeks while I was planning my little test? I hired a private investigator." Emily went dead white. Brian took a step backward. "I wanted to know exactly how my children were spending money while claiming to be struggling." I opened the folder. "Brian, your motorcycle payment is $600 a month. Emily, your spa visits average $400 monthly. Between the two of you, you spent $2,000 at restaurants last month alone." "You had us investigated." Brian's voice cracked. "I had my financial situation investigated. You see, when you're worth this kind of money, you want to make sure your assets are protected from people who might take advantage of your generosity." I smiled sweetly. The investigator's report was quite thorough. Noah was looking back and forth between his mother and uncle like he was watching a tennis match. What did the investigator find? Well, your mother and uncle have been living well beyond their means for years. The designer clothes, the expensive hobbies, the luxury purchases, all funded by credit cards, and occasional bailouts from dear old mom. I pulled out a spreadsheet. Over the past 5 years, I've given or loaned your mother and uncle $63,000 combined. Not one penny has been repaid. We would have paid you back, Emily protested. With what money? You're both barely making your minimum payments as it is. I closed the folder. But here's the interesting part. The investigator also looked into something else for me. Brian was gripping the back of the sofa so tightly his knuckles were white. What else? Your discussions about my estate. Apparently, you've both been quite vocal at family gatherings about how much this house might be worth, how my life insurance policy would help with your financial situations, and how it would be such a relief when I finally, what was Emily's phrase, stopped being a burden and made you both rich. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Noah stood up slowly. You said that about Grandma, Mom. How could you? But I wasn't done yet. The real revelation was just beginning. The investigator also discovered that Brian has been telling people I'm developing dementia, I continued, watching my son's face crumble. Apparently, you've been setting the groundwork to challenge my mental competency should I ever change my will. Noah whirled around to face his uncle. Uncle Brian, please tell me that's not true. Brian's silence was answer enough. Oh, but it gets better, I said, pulling out another document. Emily, you've been researching guardianship laws, not out of concern for my well-being, but because you found out that if I'm declared incompetent, you and Brian could potentially gain control of my assets as my closest family members. Emily's face had gone from red to gray. Mom, I never. That's not. Save it, dear, I have documented evidence. I held up my phone. Amazing what technology can do these days. The investigator gathered quite a comprehensive file on both of you. You had us followed. Brian's voice was barely a whisper. I documented my children's behavior toward their elderly mother. Yes, including the conversation where you both discussed how much easier your lives would be if I had a stroke or heart attack. I set the phone down gently. That was particularly enlightening. Noah sat down heavily in the chair across from me. I think I'm going to be sick. Don't worry, sweetheart. The good news is that your inheritance is secure. I smiled at him. The bad news for your mother and uncle is that I've taken steps to protect myself and my assets from any future manipulation attempts. Brian's head snapped up. What kind of steps? Well, first, I've had myself thoroughly examined by 3 different doctors and a psychiatrist. All have declared me completely mentally competent. Those reports are on file with my lawyers along with detailed video testimonies about my decision-making process. I was rather proud of my thoroughness. Second, I've restructured my entire estate. Noah is now my sole heir. Emily made a sound like a wounded animal. And third, I continued, enjoying their horror, I've decided to have a little fun with my newfound wealth. Brian gripped Emily's hand. What do you mean the beginning? Well, Brian, remember your friend Mike from the bank, the one you've been telling about my supposed dementia. I sipped my champagne slowly. Turns out Mike did some research into my finances when he heard you might need help with guardianship proceedings. Brian went very still. What kind of research? The kind that involves public records, lottery winner databases, and financial filings. Mike discovered something very interesting. I paused for effect. He found out about my lottery win. No, Emily whispered. Oh, yes. And Mike, being the upstanding citizen he is, contacted several people at the bank to share this fascinating information. I was thoroughly enjoying their horror. By now, everyone in your professional circles knows that Brian and Emily, Harris's mother, won $300 million, and they were trying to have her declared incompetent to steal it. Brian's face had gone completely white. They don't know the whole story, don't they? Because the story they heard is that a loving mother helped her children financially for years, won the lottery, and instead of being grateful, they plotted to have her committed so they could steal her money. I took another sip. How do you think that's playing at your workplaces? Emily was crying again. Mom, Brian's job, my reputation. Everyone will think exactly what they should think. I interrupted. That you're both greedy, ungrateful people who tried to take advantage of your elderly mother. Noah was staring at me with something approaching awe. Grandma, you orchestrated all of this, didn't you? Orchestrated is such a dramatic word. I simply allowed your mother and uncle to show their true colors, then made sure the appropriate people knew about it. I smiled at my grandson. Noah, would you like to know what you're inheriting? His eyes widened. All of it. Every penny, but more importantly, you're inheriting something your mother and uncle will never have again. I raised my glass once more. A family member who trusts you completely. Brian and Emily were about to discover that money was the least of what they'd lost. The trust documents were signed this morning, I continued, savoring every word. Noah receives everything when I pass away, but there's more. I've also established a college fund that will pay for his education through graduate school and a living allowance that ensures he'll never have to worry about money while he's studying. Noah was speechless, but Brian found his voice. Mom, you can't just cut us out completely. We're your children. You were my children, I corrected gently. Now you're just people who happen to share my DNA and my last name. Being family requires more than biology, Brian. It requires love, respect, and basic human decency. Emily was hyperventilating. What about our futures? We have nothing now. You have exactly what you gave me when I needed help, I said simply. Nothing. I walked to my desk and pulled out one final document. However, I'm not completely heartless. I've made arrangements for both of you. Brian's head snapped up. What kind of arrangements? I've arranged for you to have jobs. I handed him the paper. Brian, there's a dishwashing position available at Miller's Diner, where I used to work double shifts to pay for your college. Minimum wage, but honest work. Brian stared at the job application like it was written in a foreign language. And Emily, I've spoken to the manager at the local grocery store. They need someone for the overnight stocking shift. Again, minimum wage, but it's employment. You want us to work minimum wage jobs? Emily's voice was shrill. I want you to understand what it feels like to work for every dollar while people you love treat you like you're worthless. I sat back down, feeling lighter than I had in years. Consider it character building. Noah finally found his voice. Grandma, I don't know what to say. Say you'll use this money wisely. Say you'll remember that wealth doesn't make you better than other people. It just gives you more responsibility to be kind. I reached over and squeezed his hand. Say you'll never take family for granted the way your mother and uncle did. I promise, he whispered, tears in his eyes. Brian made one last desperate attempt. Mom, please, we'll do anything. We'll pay you back every penny. We'll apologize publicly. We'll. Brian, stop. I held up my hand. You'll do those things because you got caught, not because you're sorry. There's a difference. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden I'd tended for 30 years. You know what's funny? If you had just helped me when I asked, if you had shown even basic kindness to someone who gave you life, none of this would have happened. I would have shared my fortune gladly. We can start over, Emily pleaded. We can be the family you want us to be. I turned around and looked at these two people I had raised, who had shared my holidays, who had taken my money and my love for granted for so many years. No, I said simply. You can't, because I finally learned something important. You can't buy love, but you can definitely put a price on greed. And you've both shown me exactly what that price is. Noah stood up and hugged me tightly. Thank you, Grandma, for everything. For the test, for the lesson, for trusting me. As Brian and Emily left my house for the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete peace. My grandson had everything he needed for a bright future. And I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable the people who take your love for granted. The lottery had given me money, But my children had given me something far more valuable: the knowledge of who truly deserved my trust, and that, my friends, was worth every penny. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.